We would like to welcome you to the first in a series of virtual book events for our Watershed Moments statewide read. Watershed Moments is a 2-year multi-program initiative created by the North Carolina Humanities Council. We are a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our inaugural statewide book club invites North Carolinians to read selected works of literature so that they can dialogue and connect with one another over important issues in our state and communities. As a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the NEH, our mission is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated panel discussion on Neal and Jarrod Shusterman's book, Dry. Tonight's discussion of the themes covered in Dry presents an opportunity for us to share our experiences, consider new perspectives, and better understand the role the humanities play in helping us become more informed citizens. Thank you again for joining us this evening. It is our pleasure to welcome retired librarian and North Carolina Humanities Council Board Trustee Ed Sheary as this evening's moderator. It is also our pleasure to welcome Jacqui Castle, Dr. Deb Thomas, and Dr. Jack Scheff as this evening's featured speakers. Before we turn the event over to Ed, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Question and A tab. We encourage you to share your experience on social media with the hashtag Watershed Moments and also by tagging @NCHumanities. So I'd like to kick off this event by turning it over to Ed Sheary.
Thank you, Melissa, and I want to welcome all of you to this online book discussion. So this is the sort of thing I've been looking forward to trying online. So I hope we can have a real conversation here, not only with our panelists, but with those of you who are watching tonight. So thank you for coming. As Melissa said, I'm a retired librarian. I'm primarily a guy who likes print. So this technology, I'm just going to trust that it works. It's my pleasure really to introduce tonight's speakers. And I'm just going to start off and we'll go in order of Dr. Thomas, Dr. Scheff, and Jacqui Castle. So we'll start off with Dr. Thomas, and she is a professor and the chair of the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences at UNC-Charlotte. And she's an expert in disaster management, and that's somebody we want to know in the year 2020. Dr. Thomas. And our second panelist will be Dr. Jack Scheff. He is also from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's a professor in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences, and his specialty is climate modeling and global climate change and how global climate change affects the Earth's water cycle. And our third panelist is Jacqui Castle. She is a professional freelance writer and novelist. She also lives near Asheville, not far from where I do, and is a well-regarded dystopian novelist in her own right. Her 2000 Indie Author of the Year debut novel, The Seclusion, has achieved quite a bit of acclaim, and rumor has it she's working on a sequel. So Dr. Thomas, if you'll open with your remarks.
I put together, this isn't a presentation, not a classroom presentation, but I'm a graphics person and a geographer, so I love maps. And it is Geography Awareness Week, so a few good maps are helpful to have. So what I have up here, I thought given the nature of the book, it would be helpful to give a little Southern California context, and then in a few slides, just transport it here to North Carolina, the Carolinas, the Southeast region. We tend to think of water as a resource, right? And a free resource in the US. Los Angeles actually does import currently a huge supply of its water. So this is just a map showing that 62% of that water is imported either from the Colorado River or the state project that brings in water from the wetter part of the northern part of the state. I also have the 4 pictures along the slide, just as the slide background, to illustrate it isn't just about drought, right? There's water cycles that are part of natural systems. So we have snow, we have floods, we have thunderstorms, we have wildfires and drought that you see along the bottom there. So those are all pictures of places that I've studied. So that's kind of a fun little piece. I didn't make this map though. You could go to the next one. So that's just the situation of water in Los Angeles, which is cornerstone to the book. And this is the Colorado River piece. 2 important elements of the Colorado River Basin is every ounce of this river is claimed as it moves from Colorado in the headwaters and ends up in Baja California, down in the lower left corner of that map there. There is but a trickle left of this river. That's on a good day. That's not in drought, that every drop of water is claimed on this river by states who litigate this all the time. So before dams were built along this, and you have major dams, I'm pointing to it as if you can see me pointing, 18,500 million cubic meters of water flowed down this river. And by the time it gets to the end, it literally is a trickle, if anything at all. And this is both human use and droughts that are playing on the reduction of this water. Most of that is human use, but the southwestern part of the US also has been experiencing lots of drought. So 2 quick little illustrations, if you could, Melissa. The Earth Observatory. This is an interesting video that I think visualizes that drought cycle quite well for the Colorado River. And you can see how dramatic these changes are as it moves now from the beginning in 20,000 to 2004. That's 2006. That's just after we had a pretty major drought cycle in the West in the early 2000s. See how much that dries up. And it does return, and then it ebbs back to that really diminished level where you barely see the water flowing. If you want to go to the other graphic, we don't have to watch that whole. This illustrates by dragging back and forth. There's what it looks like when it's running high. If you drag it back the other way, that's what it looks like when it is running low. That's pretty darn dramatic, right? In terms of drought in this instance. So this is all remote sensing imagery from satellites that you can see. If you could go to the next slide. So that's the Colorado Basin, but drought and fires are not restricted to the West. In our imagination, they're in the West, but the reality is the southeastern part of the United States also experiences quite a bit of drought. This is from 2016, and you see the brown on the left map, how low the precipitation was and the water levels that year. This was the same year that the North Carolina mountains and Tennessee had the fires. So you see on the right, the imagery that shows the fire plumes. We often think about that, like I said, in the West, but it's a very real consideration here in the southeastern part of the US. On the next slide. And I put together some resources. I'm sure these can be made available to you with the links for the North Carolina Climate Center and some drought resource centers, as well as 3 resources on disaster management and emergency management. The community emergency response training is something that FEMA puts together, and that is something that you could do if you wanted to improve your community preparedness. So you can participate in that training for free, online first and then in person. So I thought some might be interested in that. They have a whole training resource center, and everybody is allowed to take 3, I believe, of those per year for free. They're all online, so that's the exciting piece. So if you wanted to know more about emergency and disaster management, that is your fun place that you can go. And then, of course, North Carolina Emergency Management. And the last slide is just some additional reads if you're interested in the topic of drought and water management. These 3 books are particularly about water in the West. They are more nonfiction books, but for popular consumption. And then an important element that I wanted to bring to our attention is one illustration, the 10 Tribes Partnership, which has been integral in the management of the Colorado Water Basin, is that this flows through Indian land and Indian Nation and First People areas. So when we think about how we consider water as a resource and free in the US, it is not the same as in all parts of the world. That is culturally bounded. So many Native American populations don't view water as a resource for us to use. It is rather a giver of life. That's quite a different viewpoint when thinking about how we use water. So I thought I'd leave you with that so we don't take too much time with lectures and move on to discussions.
All right. Thank you, Deb. Dr. Scheff, would you share a little bit with us?
Sure. I guess I thought maybe in this part we were just introducing ourselves. I didn't realize it necessarily had to have a whole lecture there. But maybe in place of something longer, I'll just maybe mention one thing that might actually come out during the discussion as well, which is just maybe to make the points. Probably a lot of you are already well aware that when we talk about water use, by people, especially by people in the United States and other Western countries, most of the water supplies, at least during normal times, are actually not being used for drinking. Most of it, most used fresh water in the United States goes to irrigating farmland, and it goes to industry. Consumption at the household is a very small fraction. So that was sort of part of what was so incredible to me about reading this book, is it was imagining if, all the farmers had already gone belly up, and all the, the industries didn't have any water anymore either. And then even then, there wasn't enough water for that tiny fraction that's actually used at people's houses, that even that dried up too. So I guess I just wanted to emphasize what an incredibly deep drought that would have had to have been. So not only for all the farmers to have filled years before, but then also not even to have enough for people to use at home. So often when we're thinking of water supplies, we're really thinking about water supplies for farmers first, because that's usually the single biggest use. But still, certainly that the events in the book, I think, could happen, right, if rains were to fail for a long enough time. And so it was eye-opening thinking about that.
All right, thank you. Ms. Castle, help us with setting the stage for the questions to come by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I think you covered a good part of it. I'm just going to do a brief introduction so that we can get on to our discussion. But like you said, my name is Jacqui. I'm a journalist and freelance writer and novelist, and I live in Asheville. I spent 6 years as a journalist for the Mountain Express, and now I spend most of my time writing fiction and doing local content writing for small businesses. My novel, The Seclusion, came out in 2018. It is a dystopian novel that's also similar to Neal's in that it kind of walks the line between fact and fiction, and is meant to be one of those stories that you could see happening if things don't turn away from our current reality. and it was named the winner of the North Carolina Author Project, and the sequel will be out next year. And I'm just very honored to be participating in this discussion with these wonderful scientists and to just be along for the ride. So thank you for having me.
All right, and thank you all. Let's talk a little bit about the book. And the premise here is really pretty exciting. We tend to forget how easy it is when we go into the kitchen and turn the faucet on and there's water. Once in a while, we're going to be asked to conserve water. Dr. Thomas mentioned 2016, which was a bad year, particularly up here in Western North Carolina, for drought and fire and some water shortages, but it's usually short term. It's not something that goes on for years. The premise of the Shusterman's book, Dry, begins with a scene where Alyssa's mother turns on the faucet and no water comes out. And this becomes known as the tap out. The main characters, Alyssa, Garrett, Kelton, Jacqui, and later Henry, tell the story of tap out. Though Californians have been restricting the use of water for some time, the day the tap out begins reveals that Arizona and Nevada have cut off the Colorado River to California. Many are caught by surprise and unprepared for this, which leads to a rush on stores of water and all beverages. There's hope that the government will manage the situation and provide some relief, but as the days pass, not enough help arrives, and it becomes clear that the main characters and everyone else in the story are on their own and will have to do anything to survive. So that is sort of the basic premise of this novel, and I recommend it to you. It's an exciting read, even in 2020 when many of us don't sleep much. This is worth your time. We've got some questions prepared for our panelists, and they're loosely organized by theme. The first theme is really just the broader topic of drought and climate change, and I'm going to address these to Dr. Scheff. The basic premise of dry is due to these long-term drought conditions, changing climate, and not managing water resources. California has no access to water. So the tap out impacts Alyssa's community and indeed the entire state. So in a broad sense, what is drought? And are there different types of droughts? What type of drought has the southeastern United States, specifically North Carolina, experienced previously?
All right, thanks, Ed. And I suppose, Deb or Jack, feel free to cut in with things to add as well. But the basic types of drought, so you would start with what's called a meteorological drought, which is just when, less rain is falling than usual, for a period of, say, weeks or months. If it goes on long enough, then it starts to become called an agricultural drought or sometimes ecological drought when plants don't have enough water. So we saw reference to that at the beginning of the book with the Central Valley farms being abandoned for lack of water for the crops. And then finally, if it goes on long enough, if the precipitation or rainfall shortage goes long enough, becomes a hydrological drought, which is where there's not enough water, in reservoirs and lakes and rivers and groundwater, to provide for people. And of course, in the book, the event that's taken place is, progressed to just an extreme hydrological drought where, actual water supplies for consumption are reduced. And it's magnified by the fact that it's in Southern California, which, has far more people in it than could be sustainably supplied by the water resources that are generated in Southern California, which is why on the map that Deb showed there, they have to import so much of their water from elsewhere. So in North Carolina, we've experienced all those types of droughts as well. They've never been as severe as in Southern California. We're a much wetter place. So even when we have a drought, it doesn't get to those levels, thankfully. But yeah, as I believe Deb mentioned or Ed mentioned, as recently as 2016, we had hydrological drought that was severe enough here, and especially in the western and west central parts of the state, that cities were having to start thinking about not water rationing, but the encouragement of conservation measures for water use in different parts of the state, especially in the West. And the same thing also happened in the 2007 drought a number of years ago, where over large parts of North Carolina, there were cities that were actually thinking about more Californian-style water restrictions. But luckily for us, this is a relatively wet area, so we never got anywhere near, even what California experienced during their real drought several years ago.
What factors, contribute to drought? I mean, other than maybe lack of rain, but are there meteorological trends that are at play here we need to understand?
Well, I suppose you can think about meteorological factors. You can also think about human factors as well. So, in terms of the meteorology, maybe it's just a strong, high pressure system that stays over one region for a long time and prevents rain-bearing storms from reaching there. That was certainly what was responsible for the recent California drought. There were just 3 winters in a row of extremely high pressure in the atmosphere over California that really prevented any serious rain. But then there's the human factor as well. So if there are more people in a region than really could be sustained by the local water supplies, which I think I was kind of getting at earlier, then the impact of any drought is magnified because there's no local water sources to make up, from the shortage. So Southern California is sort of, and I suppose Arizona, Las Vegas, places like that are sort of uniquely precarious in terms of their water supply in the United States, because so much of their water comes from, hundreds or thousands of miles away in the headwaters of the Colorado River in Colorado. So they're so dependent on this imported water. And then of course there's the human aspect of, what is water well conserved, right? So the same meteorological drought could cause a much greater water shortage for people if they don't conserve it well compared to, if they implement measures. Though of course in this scenario, right, the water is turned off, right? No matter how well they conserved, it didn't seem to matter. So this was, again, a very, very extreme scenario.
Yes, politics seem to have been involved in that aspect of it, of the water being literally shut off.
Right, right. There was clearly at the end, I guess we shouldn't say anything about the end of the book, but that's clearly there was a political decision to turn off the water. The governors didn't want to share, they didn't want to play ball. So that's another thing that we don't generally have to worry about here in North Carolina. So our water supplies are mostly generated within our state, in our mountains.
Excuse me, Deb.
Sorry, I apologize. I was just going to add that one interesting piece in the book that I think actually does pretty consistently happen is drought, while it's very chronic and long that they reference, and like maybe they actually say in the book we probably should have known, right? But drought functions in a way that it still catches us by surprise. And that element of the book was nicely captured, because invariably that does happen with our droughts. Suddenly the crops are withered and we're like, there's a drought, even though we had known it for months and months and months before, typically. So just thought that was an interesting piece to add that the book captured well.
Jack,
agreed.
One more question. Explain the difference between weather and climate.
Yeah, so I suppose this, in some way, this book is getting at both a little bit. I mean, weather is just, 1 year it rains a lot, and another year maybe it doesn't rain so much. Just the vagaries of what happens differently, every week or every year, or even every few years, I tend to think of as weather. And then climate is just sort of the universe of all the weather that could happen out there. So maybe the climate of California, 100 years ago, maybe couldn't have quite as severe droughts as it's capable of happening now. So climate is sort of that window of what's possible. And unfortunately, in a lot of parts of the world, that window of what's possible is expanding into drier conditions than probably were possible in the past. Though I should add that California has already been vulnerable to very, very extreme drought, even before any kind of global warming or recent climate change. There's records from ancient tree rings in the Southwest showing that during the Middle Ages, there were prolonged and severe droughts in California and the Southwestern United States, the likes of which actually have not been recorded today, but presumably still could happen. I think what's different now as the climate has warmed is just that it's not so much a difference in several things are different. Maybe the most important one is that now often rainfall is more erratic than it was. And actually, it's a consequence of that the air can hold more humidity, ironically, makes us actually have to sometimes wait longer to get each rain. So the risk of prolonged drought increases. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we will have prolonged drought, because that's still weather, right? In any given year or set of years, the weather could change. So the climate is more just it's what weather is possible. And that, so it's maybe that's not the greatest way to answer it. So I like to think about it.
Yeah, I think most of us think of weather and climate interchangeably, and it's, you know, it's something where it's cold today here in Asheville and windy, and does that mean it's not, we're not experiencing global warming anymore? So thank you for that.
Right. So that's, yeah, it goes to those different things. So I guess for that question, the way you want to think, the way I always teach to my students in my climate change class, at least, is, you know, when it's cold these days, it's not as cold as a cold day used to be, you know, in our grandparents' time. So the temperature in any given weather situation has warmed up, you know, compared to what it was. And so maybe in California, you know, maybe, you know, you could have a wet period today, but that maybe when they have a wet period today, it's sort of briefer and more intense than the wet periods in the past. And then when you have a dry period today, you know, it's longer, you know, maybe a little more severe than the dry periods in the past. Though again, if you go far back enough into the past, they've had really severe droughts there naturally. So not everything is due to human-caused climate change. California is already a place that experiences very, very severe droughts, even without any kind of global warming. So whatever we're doing, to the extent we're changing that, it's just, you know, adding to that a bit.
All right, thank you. Let's turn to our next theme, which is really disasters and disaster response and relief, and the impact of disasters on infrastructure. There's a frequent mention that in the book that the tap out isn't receiving national attention from FEMA, at least not at first, because there's another disaster, a Hurricane Noah, happening at the same time. So Dr. Thomas, we'll turn these next few questions to you. How can a disaster be defined? And are there any factors unique to North Carolina that make disasters more or less likely to occur here?
Unmute. There we go.
There you go.
That's a great question. So there isn't a singular definition. That's the exciting piece. But depending on where you are, there are events that occur. And depending on where you are, different types of events are more common. So I thought this might be a really nice use of the chat for people who are participating. If you wanted to type in the chat, what kinds of events, hazard events, do we have in North Carolina? I think there was one person I saw from France, so you can put France in there, but go ahead and type in the chat the disasters that are most frequent here across North Carolina. Floods, mudslides, what kinds of natural events have you experienced? Hurricanes, inland tornadoes. Those are great. So lots of different kinds of events. Earthquake, not frequent, but we just had one, right? Mudslides. So the earthquake gives a great example of a low probability event, right? And then hurricanes are more common here. And so depending on where you are, different kinds of events happen more frequently and others not as frequently, but all create risk. A disaster is when those events interface with our human systems and our social systems and overwhelm them. So rather than a small event that just as a blip and we all go on with our daily lives, that's not a disaster, right? It's a disaster when our local resources and response capabilities are exceeded. And so it's that event, the physical event. These can be human-induced events too. So you can think about a train derailment, a chemical plant explosion, right? Those are also events that emerge out of human systems. And then those interface with the places that we live, play, and work. And that is when people are impacted. And that's when you get the disaster. So an important piece for disaster response then is that overwhelmed. Local ability to respond is overwhelmed.
Following up with that, how does North Carolina prepare for disaster relief?
It's a great question. And so, like I said, it starts local. So first and foremost, we should be preparing in our households. That's a little plug. And if you go to the FEMA website, or readiness.gov, you'll see cues for doing that. But our local counties have emergency managers, and there is an emergency response plan in our communities. That's where it starts, because those are the first responders and the people that are going to be there when something happens, as opposed to resources coming in from the outside. So when those get overwhelmed, the state may get involved, or an event that's big enough where it affects multiple counties. A hurricane on the east in eastern North Carolina, for example, is multiple counties. So the state will be coordinating. Beyond that, and this was alluded to in the book, the governor makes a request to FEMA to come to assist in these efforts. But typically, our state and locals are taking the lead. FEMA doesn't come in and lead that effort unless it gets really, 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 really big. And then you're sort of in the realm of catastrophic, like we might be seeing in the book, right? So disasters start local in terms of our response, and then the state guides that. We have an emergency response framework in the US. It's legislation, but it's a framework. And within that, every part of government and nonprofit are also involved. The American Red Cross, for example, has a role. So these emergency support functions are sectors to which these different agencies and organizations assist, and they're part of the response, coordinated response. So it's a coordinated effort. I think something else that is important, there's a dual piece that's important for this book and for drought, but all hazards and disasters. And it's this idea of mitigation or prevention, right? So when we do disaster management, one element that we want to work on in our local communities and in our states is preventing disasters from happening. So this is why sometimes we have dams to help with flood control, right? That's an example of that. But the way we do our land use in our communities to prevent runoff with lots of vegetation, that reduces runoff, that reduces your flood risk. If we cement everything, then that increases our flood risk. So there are many things we can do in how we build our cities, how we organize ourselves that can reduce and prevent that risk in the first place. Wanted to mention that because it's an element that's often forgotten in disaster response, but the prevention is an important piece. And in the context of the book, you have water management, which I know you're coming to. So water management becomes a very important tool for prevention of the disaster.
One of the things that Dry does quite graphically is portraying this cascading breakdown of society and infrastructure, sort of failure after systemic failure. How accurately do you think that's portrayed in the book?
That's a great question. Certainly you get the cascading failures, and we study that in disasters. So what you're looking at in Southern California is a catastrophe. It's beyond a disaster, right? So a whole entire population of that basin is impacted. I hedge here a little because in general, people don't panic in some of the ways that they portray in the book. I think the book does a good job of portraying different kinds of potential responses and people's reactions. But if we think about Puerto Rico and Hurricane Maria, for example, when the whole island essentially didn't have electricity, and the electricity was not returned to the entire island for over a year, right? You had an entire island, an entire population that was without not just electricity, but also drinkable water for a very long period of time. And you didn't see the kinds of things happening in the same way as are portrayed in the book, sort of an extreme of what could happen. But Los Angeles is a big place and there's no rainwater there. So very different kind of scenario. But the cascade is something in a catastrophe. The cascade is something that we will frequently see. So one system fails, then the next fails, then the next fails. And so we are no longer able to really respond in a systematic way. I think Katrina as well. We still think about Hurricane Katrina in this way.
Thank you. Let's change themes a little bit and talk about dystopian literature and imagery. And the character Alyssa refers to some of the characters that they meet as water zombies. So I'm going to address these to Jacqui. First, what are some of the some elements that make up a dystopian world?
Good question. There are usually a few common themes that you'll find in dystopian novels. They can involve taking a what-if scenario and just pushing it to its extreme conclusion. So we definitely see that in this novel. It could be something like government control or technological control or loss of individualism in a society usually that rejects critical thinking, and then also extreme environmental destruction. So a dystopian world could contain all of those things, like some dystopian novels that you've probably read, or just a couple of them. And so in the case of Dry, the focus is on environmental destruction and then on the survival of our protagonists. So there's usually two arcs at play in a dystopian fiction novel. There's the arc of the protagonists, and then there's also the arc of society itself. And so there's a lot of interplay going on between those two things. And so a strong tenet of dystopian fiction is following very real fears that we might have in our actual society. And so it often is kind of a mirror of some of the things that are going on in our everyday lives and pushing those to the extreme conclusion, and then watching regular people navigate those fears and find a path for survival. And so even though dystopian fiction is dark, a lot of people aren't drawn to it. There are a lot of readers and writers that do find it cathartic and hopeful as well, simply because it immerses us in those things that scare us and then show us, you know, how someone can survive a situation like that.
Okay. Well, why are zombies so prevalent as a theme in dystopian literature and science fiction novels?
This is a fun question for me because I've never written about zombies, but we'll talk about it anyway. I have a lot of author friends that have written about zombies, and I enjoy reading zombie fiction, of course. And I think part of the reason zombies are fun and appealing is because most zombie stories aren't really about the zombies themselves. They're about the people who survive. And in most stories, death is kind of seen as the worst thing that can happen. But in zombie fiction, you kind of flip all that on its head, and that sweet release of death is ultimately taken away as an option. And so, you know, you also are dealing with zombies that are essentially human. So they might be your neighbors or your friends or people that you knew in real life. And, you know that you're one bite or one scratch away from losing control of your own brain and basically becoming them. And so it adds a lot of layers to play around with. And I think that authors like to play around with the morality of some of those situations. So we have all these fears at play at the same time. We've got fear of death, we have fear of something worse than death, and then we also have that fear of what we are ultimately capable of if our survival is on the line. And so, you know, we kill what we want to avoid becoming, but in that process, we can lose what makes us who we are. And so it's just a great theme to have some fun with.
Yeah, my first reaction to the water zombies are, these aren't zombies, you know, not in the sense that I know zombies, but
Yeah.
Anyway, fun. Let's change themes again.
Well, can talk a little bit more about the water zombies. I know. But I think that Neal wanted his depiction of the water zombies to, you know, not be the same as a zombie in a zombie fiction, but to bring to mind that image of the brainless, insatiable shell of a human, basically. So in this story, the water zombies, you know, have experienced a level of dehydration that has started to impact their brains and allowed their animalistic instincts to take over. And so it's kind of like with traditional zombies, the goal, you know, would be to find others to kill, but with the water zombies, the goal is to find water. And so there's that hidden tension, I think, you know, with Alyssa and the other characters that's also present in zombie fiction, where when you're reading it as the reader, you know that even if they deal with this group, there's probably more waiting around the corner. And so there's that kind of buzz of tension throughout the whole novel that they're never going to defeat this problem. There's going to be more. And then again, like other zombie fiction, you get to watch the characters in Dry encounter them while also knowing how utterly close they are to becoming them.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's ease themes over to water usage, scarcity, and conservation. So we'll turn back to our two professors for these questions. In the book, Alyssa noted several factors that indicated the water supply, there were water supply problems prior to the tap out, and farmers leaving the Central Valley and agriculture because of the drought, the passage of frivolous use initiatives to curb water usage, etc. So what are the benefits and consequences of how humans use water? Either one of you.
Yeah, benefits and consequences of how humans use water. So I guess maybe that in some way this sort of gets to what I opened up with there when we were introducing ourselves, that there, you know, we do gain a lot of benefits from using water, but it's just this strange paradox where most of what we're using it for, we don't really think about. It's not the water coming out of our taps, it's water to help grow food for the most part. And then it's also water, you know, for like large industrial uses. So I guess, you know, it seems like in this case, you know, in this world that we read about in Dry, right, the people of Southern California had already long since cut out all those uses. So that was sort of a twist that I wasn't expecting here in the book. I thought they were just sort of going to say, well, you know, there's a drought and then we ran out of water. But no, they actually, you know, I was impressed that they really did their research and they realized that the only way that people would really run out of drinking water is if all these other uses went away first. So everybody was conserving really well, right? They had all long since stopped watering their lawns. They had stopped filling their swimming pools. They had stopped doing all these other things, and yet still they ran out, which goes to show, again, just how unusually severe this drought was. So I guess to me, this book didn't actually seem to have, this book wasn't trying, I thought it was sort of going to be saying, oh, look, you know, you guys are all frivolously losing water. And, you know, if you hadn't been, then everybody would be fine. But no, it's saying, hey, these people did everything right, and yet still they ran out because of forces that were really beyond their control. So I'm not quite sure that the book went in the direction that I think we were expecting it to on that question. Unless is that answering your question all there, Ed, or are you really getting at something else?
No, I think you're answering the question. And I think that the next question, we've touched on some of this too, but you know, what is water scarcity? I mean, is there a technical definition of some sort? And why are some areas more prone to water scarcity than others?
I suppose I can talk about this one too. Again, I think it was a little bit tying into something that I said in the first round of questions as well, that, water scarcity, it depends both on how much water there is available somewhere and then how many people there are. So Southern California is, in some ways, it's one of the most water scarce places in the United States because it's such a populated area, but has so little in the way of local water supplies. As Deb, illustrated really well with that map of hers there too. Whereas North Carolina, sort of the opposite, right? We have a lot of locally generated, rivers and streams and groundwater that are usually quite plentiful, and we're also not nearly as densely populated as, Southern California. We have fewer people in our entire state than just the LA metro area does in that metro area alone. So for both of those reasons, right, we're a lot less water scarce than Southern California. But maybe that's sort of just a little microcosm of why different places have different sort of levels of water scarcity, right? It's both something about nature and it's also something about people. Do you have anything to add there, Deb, as well?
Yeah, I was just going to add, so, there's availability, and that varies by region and climate areas, but it's also about quality as well. And sometimes we forget that piece, and we get very buffered by being able to turn on our taps in the US and drink out of our drinking water, or out of the water coming out of the tap, right? But not all places in the US have that. That's an important piece to remember. When we're in urban areas, we tend to have that, but not all rural areas do have high quality drinking water. And then if we think about an environmental crisis or a disaster, we just have to go so far as Flint, Michigan. So there's not scarcity, but there sure isn't quality, right? So that combination, I think, is important for us to keep in our mind's eye as well, because we do get so accustomed to just turning it on and it flowing out.
Yeah, great point there, Deb. Sort of one last question in this theme, and I want to add a little something to it of my own, but what kinds of conservation measures are in use today to maximize quality and quantity of available fresh water? And how do those methods relate to what was described in dry? And one thing I wanted to add is early on, desalinization efforts obviously failed totally. Is that a possible remedy for this in the long term? Either one of our docs?
Desalinization is used throughout parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world. So you just can't put it in place as a response. I think therein lies the challenge, right? This is something you do through infrastructure planning and mitigation, right, into the future. That's an investment project. You can't just set up one of those as a response, typically. Small ones, perhaps, but probably not for the whole city of LA.
Yeah, that's just what I would have said as well, right? The shoestring nature of what was described in the book was obviously not enough, but the technology itself, right? If planning goes into it and real money is put in, it's done in advance, right? It could be fairly effective. The big downside to desalination is it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of electrical power. So you have to have a reliable source of that, hopefully one that doesn't make its own greenhouse gases too, or maybe you're just contributing the same problem you're trying to solve.
And if you have the hydroelectric power to run a desalinization plant, you probably don't need it, right?
Oh, that's true.
Except the hydroelectric power is part of the damming that's along the Colorado River. That's part of the problem, the cascade.
Right.
All right, yeah. For our last theme, let's talk a little bit about journalism. And at the beginning of the tap out, it's noted that local media is responding to the situation as a flow crisis and urges everyone to remain calm. And as the novel continues, the local reporters start to cover the situation in more depth. 5 days into the crisis, the tap out becomes national news. So I'll ask this to Jacqui and to Deb. First of all, where and how do journalists find the news?
Happy to go first. So I think news is normally found in various ways. You know, in our modern world, it's often seeing what surfaces on social media, what ends up in a journalist's inbox, checking to see what early stories are breaking on other media outlets and also need additional coverage. And then, you know, sometimes if it's a more in-depth story, just a single journalist's curiosity. And so that would normally be an investigative story that would be not a time-sensitive one. So a journalist is following kind of down the rabbit hole and unearthing every piece of the story and writing an in-depth piece. But what we generally think of as daily news journalists focus on covering emerging stories as they unfold. And that's where things can get a little lost in the shuffle, because deciding what is newsworthy can be pretty subjective pursuit and vary based on, you know, what outlet you're working for and what people, you know, rise up as worthy of being covered that day.
All right.
Could I add a little tiny bit? Because I think
Please.
it relates back to my comment about disasters starting local, right? And so our local news coverage will often be about our locales and our region. And the example I think we can just give, the rainfall that we had last week, I dare say our 5 inches of rain barely made a blip out west, right? Not so relevant. As we were moving through our hurricane sequence on the East Coast, we did not hear as much about the fires on the West Coast. We heard quite a bit, but given how large and how intense they were, we didn't hear nearly as much. So it tends to be quite regionally emphasized in disasters, I think, until they sort of hit that catastrophic level. And if we think about international coverage, it often is about the parts of the world that we know or have connections with or political ties will elevate in terms of what gets reported. And there's something important here, because it can be so local and the management issues so local. This is my personal opinion, that the local papers have kind of gone to the wayside, and we have fewer and fewer of those. Becomes a bigger and bigger challenge for some of our environmental management and disaster management, among other issues with not having our local journalism outlets and papers. That's my 2 cents on that. I see some nods, so.
Yes, total agreement. And there are a few tenets, you know, that journalists are taught to follow, and I think it goes along with what Deb's saying. And so a couple of those values that journalists are taught are timeliness, proximity, impact, prominence, relevance, and conflict. And so obviously when you look at some of those things, that they will apply to a local news story way before they're going to apply to a national news story. And so, you know, it's like in the story Dry, that shift is going to happen at different times. And yeah, not soon enough, usually.
Yeah, Deb, you touched on something that was one of the questions, but is the tone of news coverage important in disaster response and in how people will and how citizens will respond to a disaster? Is that something you study?
So I don't study the journalistic aspects of disasters. But what you will see are a lot of personal interest kind of stories. And the reason for this is, I think we even see this with COVID a little bit right now. When you hear 250,000 people have perished, sounds like a lot and it sounds overwhelming, but it doesn't necessarily bring it home. So those are 250,000 individuals with families. Like in the book, it was 200,000 people, right? A very comparable number. And so to have meaning for us, they will pull out individual stories quite frequently. The one I always kind of chuckle at is, it seems like especially with flood events or hurricanes, they'll always focus on the baby that was born during the event. And there's always a baby that was born somewhere in a hospital or out during the floods at home. So, but yeah, the personal interest piece is a spin. I don't think, though, that it takes the national news coverage necessarily to capture the attention of our federal agencies. Those are not as perhaps interrelated. The federal resources can have their attention elsewhere because of other events. And we have to remember that FEMA, as a government agency goes, is a really small agency. In fact, it's a small agency. So once they're pulled to one or two disasters, they're pretty maxed out at that point.
Okay. Any last thoughts on this, Jacqui? I know you are a journalist in part two. What role does journalism play these days in creating an informed citizenry?
Ooh, big question these times. But I think that it plays a big role. I think that, the goal of journalism is to provide citizens with information that they need to make informed decisions about their lives and their communities and their societies and their government. And so the best journalism is done when keeping that value in mind. I think that when you have a populace that's massively uninformed or is swimming in misinformation, that it's difficult to really have our democracy come forward if we don't have the information we need to make decisions. And so, quality journalism provides people with reliable and up-to-date information. And then also, as Deb was saying, connects that information to their lives in a way that they will see the value of, what they are reading. And so I think that, I guess the role that I would say that journalism plays in fostering an informed citizenry cannot be understated. I think it's vitally important.
Well, I think it's time to wrap this part of the program up. And Caitlin, have we heard from the audience with any questions or comments that they would like to forward to our panel?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. And I'd like to just point out again, if you do have a question you haven't gotten in yet, please pop it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll see if we can get to them on air. Our first question comes from Christina, and she says, we all have people in our lives who still think that climate change, or as they still call it, global warming, isn't impacted by humans. What are some thoughts on how to nudge them to think and learn otherwise? So this might get to the resources listed earlier.
All right, I think any of our panelists could tackle that one, but who would like to take a try at it?
Yeah. I often recommend sort of books rather than, things on the internet or videos or the like. I feel like sometimes that helps a little bit for somebody to actually be able to sit down and read a book for smart, popular audiences about the issue. Because I feel like so much of what we learn about all issues is sort of through the media or through the internet, and then we can often sort of develop this very one-sided view about what the issue is. So sometimes there are particular books I recommend that are sort of just general introductions to the climate change issue without any of the politics or without any of the broader sort of fights in our society brought in, right? But just about the climate change issue itself. And then also, I guess maybe it's easier for me to do this than some, but I always, sometimes for those folks, I'll just like to remind them about sort of the parallels between what's going on now and all the ways that, our planet naturally warmed up and cooled down in the past. That in some way, what's happening now is no different from those. The only difference is that we're making the CO2 by burning things, right? Rather than nature, making the rise in CO2 with, say, volcanic eruptions or something. But that other than that, it's the same as what we know has already happened. So it'd be pretty strange if it didn't happen this time with the rise in CO2 that we're currently experiencing. But it's a little easier maybe for me to do that, the subject matter expert. Be curious to sort of hear what the rest of you guys do in those conversations as well.
All right, any other comments from the panel? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jack. Caitlin.
Yes, the second question comes from Alan. He says, instead of a dystopian novel about climate change, what do you think contemporary realistic novel about climate change might look like or be about?
Jacqui,
you willing to take a try at that one?
Sure, I'll say hi to Alan Gratz, who is a fellow Asheville author. So hey, Alan. I think that maybe combining some of the topics that we were talking about into an actual human's experience with how climate change has affected their lives would be a wonderful way to approach that.
If you haven't already seen, I don't have the links right now, there are several documentaries on climate refugees at the moment. So there are already people who are climate refugees and having to move as a result of different aspects of climate change, whether that be sea level rise, flooding, etc. And they're quite powerful. So a really good dystopian kind of book around that would be really great, Jacqui. With this, a climate refugee is the
Alan might actually have one. He's got a lot more books than I do. You have to pop it in the chat if you do.
All right. All right. Another question, Caitlin.
If I can be permitted, I kind of had a follow-up for Jacqui because I thought that question was super interesting.
He's not yet working on
it. Alan. But I guess, what do you think it is about books on some of these, really difficult subjects or challenging experiences that, helps us break it down or take something that's, big and hard to understand, like climate change, where it has all this scientific background and all this political intrigue into it. What is it about some of these, science fiction or dystopian books or realistic books that helps us understand it?
I think it's definitely, the power of story to put us in someone else's shoes is really impactful. And so I think that we, as people, want to relate to others, and authors use that, to make sure that you're connecting with their characters. And so if you can be in someone else's situation and experience everything that they're experiencing, through words, then that is going to cultivate a sense of empathy for what they are going through. And then also hopefully, open your eyes to maybe a point of view that you hadn't held before.
Thank you, Ed, for allowing my my aside there.
Yeah.
And we did have two kind of comments from the chat that are both sort of around the North Carolina specific context of water and disaster. One was asking about fracking in North Carolina, and another was looking at an article from the High Country News that was talking about California and contaminated groundwater. So I guess, do you guys have any comments about either of these situations or how the volatility of these issues around water is continuing to, in some cases, it appears, accelerate?
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard of the VOC contamination issue with the fires. I have to go and look at that. So thanks for bringing that to our attention. It sounds like something relatively new. The fracking and water quality, I'm not sure, Deb might have some things to say about this as well. I'm not completely an expert in that. But I guess my understanding is that a lot of the problems with fracking contaminating groundwater were early on in the history of the fracking technology, maybe about 10 years ago or so, when it wasn't, I mean, nothing's ever perfect, but it wasn't as safe as it was now, and that fluids used in the fracking leaked out, and the fracking fluids contaminated aquifers. But that's fairly rare today with fracking. At least it's not the concern that it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. That's my general understanding. But I'm not completely confident about that. I'm more of a meteorologist and climatologist. I'm not sure if, Deb, if you have some more context on that as well.
Yeah, so a couple of topics. So if you ever see the videos of the planes or the helicopters dropping the pink stuff, that's fire retardant, not water. And that does make its way into drinking water. So there were some big fires west of Colorado Springs about 4 years ago. I'm going to lose the years, but in fact, within about a week of those fires, they were finding that fire retardant in the city water system. So not even groundwater. So that is something that does happen and ends up in the streams and the groundwater, and somewhat studied. I personally don't study it. The other piece is the smoke, right, in terms of contamination. So we, even in the last year, had smoke here from fires in other places. And Susan, love High Country News as an outlet. So I love seeing that posted there. And then in regard with the fracking, I moved here from Colorado, so where fracking is a very intense environmental issue, particularly as it interfaces with water. And there's some really good documentaries out about the contamination now that occurs or has occurred. And one of them that happened in Colorado was that people were able to light their drinking water coming out of their faucet. If they put a match there, the water would light on fire, right? So that's the tap water for some folks. That was probably 8 to 10 years ago that was unfolding in Colorado. So there's, like I said, some good documentaries on that.
So is that improved any in terms of the frequency of that happening, or is that still as much of a problem as ever?
I think it's highly debated because, of course, you will have the fracking companies saying that the technology has improved, and it probably has improved, and that it's not an issue. And then you have people who have water issues in their homes that they attribute to it, and people very concerned about the environmental contamination. So they were re-injecting some of the fracking fluid in Colorado, so into the wells. So that was part of the problem. But I'm also not a fracking expert. Just got to live the debates in Colorado. Not restricted to Colorado though. Pennsylvania.
All right. Caitlin, any other comments come in?
No, nothing in the chat or the Q&A feature. So they slowed down to a trickle.
All right. Well, I think we can begin to wrap up tonight's program. I want to personally thank our panelists. This was a terrific conversation, and it's almost the sense of being in the same room, so I appreciate that. And I also particularly want to thank Melissa Giblin, who put this program together, ably assisted by Caitlin Stanley. The North Carolina Humanities Council staff, that's been one of the real privileges of working as a trustee of the council is getting to know them. They're a terrific bunch. So I'm going to turn this back over to them, and they'll close this out. So thank you much.
All right. Well, a very special thank you to Ed Sheary for moderating this conversation, and to Jacqui Castle, Dr. Deb Thomas, and Dr. Jack Scheff for sharing their perspectives in conversation. At the conclusion of this event, you will receive a brief survey to complete. So we would greatly appreciate you completing that survey to hear your feedback on the program. And our next Zoom event will be a virtual small group book discussion on Dry, the book that we talked about tonight in conversation, on December 9th. So Caitlin is going to pop our website link in, and you can go there in the coming days to learn how to register for that event. So we hope to see you there. And we want to thank everyone again for attending and taking time out of their evening, and to wish you all to have a good evening. So thank you for attending.